So if you drive along State Road 10, or I suppose you drive along Queen Road for that matter, since it's at the corner, though why you'd be driving along Queen Road I can't possibly imagine, you will see this stone that has been there since 1830 something or other, 1836, and this sign that was put up a little more recently, because the stone is fading a little bit, and to be perfectly honest, because the stone leaves out some names, and we thought we should fill in, particularly those of us whose names were left out, thought we should fill in a longer list of the pioneers. So thank you so much. So go see it. It's our local historical marker, and it commemorates the day in July, the 26th of July in 1836, when the settlers came here. So today's presentation is not coincidentally scheduled to be as close to that as we can get. It's still be Saturday. So these people were pioneers. As it happens, those people were all child pioneers that lived long enough to have photographs taken of them. But we'll talk more about them later. But those are the faces of people who arrived here on the afternoon of July 1836, with the exception of this lady who got here the previous year in 1835. I'll say more about that too. So what do you have to do to be a pioneer in Indiana? Well, we have an official Society of Indiana Pioneers. I'm a member. And they used to have a fairly complicated formula that said, well, going by the date of organization of your county, then allowing so many years, and they finally decided that was just not worth the trouble of enforcing, and divided the state into two categories. So if you're in a blue county, your ancestor has to have settled here before December 31st of 1840, and if you're in a yellow county, then your ancestor has to have settled here before 1850. So before 1851, during 1850. So you can see that we're a yellow county, and that means that these are the things that happened in the pioneer period, give or take. Got more things than that happened, but at least all of those things that we've all heard of took place. Some of them that are particularly important that we'll come back to. Indiana statehood is relatively important, I suppose. The Mammoth Internal Improvements Act and the Michigan Road Treaty. These are early efforts to arrange transportation in the state. I'll say more towards the end about why we wanted to arrange transportation, but they're part of that system. And as you probably remember, the Mammoth Internal Improvements Act meant Indiana went bust. The idea was they were going to build roads, they were going to build canals, they were going to build railroads. The people in the South didn't see any need for all that. The people in the North wanted it. The compromise was, we'll put these things in and we'll build them all at once. Anybody with common sense would have said, well, which one of these is going to make the most money? We'll build that one first, then we'll use the money from that to build the next one and so on. But no, they borrowed money from big guys in New York and they're going to build everything at once. There was a financial panic in the fall of 1837. The whole thing, worldwide financial panic, but the whole thing collapsed, and Indiana ended up so much in hock that when we had a second constitution in 1851, one of the provisions in the 1851 Constitution is no borrowing money. You may have heard of James F.D. Lanier, a big financier in the history of Indiana. He was the man who negotiated with our creditors twice, once to cut the bill in half and then again to cut the remaining bill in half. And the main security that Indiana offered to its creditors was the land the federal government had given to Indiana to pay for the Wabash and Erie Canal. That land wasn't necessarily on the canal, it was just some place where they could sell it and raise money for the canal. So if you live on the east side of the lake, your property, if it was part of the original Indian reservation, will say someplace in the deeds that it belonged at one point to the Wabash and Erie Canal Company, because the land went from the Indians briefly to the state of Indiana, then to the canal company in order to pay off our creditors. So it doesn't mean that your house was actually on the canal, which was down through Logansport, but it does mean that your property was sold in order to pay for the canal, or at least to get us out of the debt that we'd gotten ourselves into in the course of the canal. Michigan Road, of course, important because that allowed people to get here. It wasn't much of a road at first. Marshall County is organized in 1836. It's cut off from the bottom of St. Joseph County is what happened. So St. Joe was already there, and we were Plymouth Township of St. Joe County, and then we became a separate county. Our Indians leave in 1837. The Plymouth Indians go in 1838. In 1839, Bayliss Dixon buys the western quarter of a square mile. The back edge of that is the driveway behind the building we're in. The other edge of his quarter mile is next to Patty's house, which I keep forgetting whether that's Coolidge or Harding. Whichever president, Harding, yeah. So Harding Court is the other edge of that quarter mile. Buys it in 1839, he gets married, and in 1844 he plats out a town. So the Uniontown, which we're obviously sitting in, comes from the pioneer period from Bayliss Dixon's farm. And on the east shore, they're a little slower, of course, because the Indians were still there, and then there was the whole canal company thing. So settlers begin to move into buildings in the east shore in the fall of 1844, shortly after Uniontown is organized. So that's the time in which you were being a pioneer. So who were pioneers? Well, first of all, not this guy. You will see Moses Scott's name showing up frequently from people who are trying to talk about pioneers around Maxentucky. And the reason is newspaper articles like this, which if you don't read them carefully, say that Moses Scott built the first houses at Maxentucky, and that is true. It's also true that Moses Scott was a pioneer. He was a pioneer in Logansport. The connection between the two things, however, is that Moses Scott, pioneer in Logansport, was a carpenter. So he came here and built houses, but not for himself to live in. He built houses for the Indians to live in. So Chief Niswaukee and his brother, and then Aubanabi farther south, they all had I would say Western-style homes. I don't mean Greek revival, but they had log cabins. And these log cabins were nice enough. I mean, Moses Scott was a good carpenter. When Chief Niswaukee moved out, a squatter, an English settler squatter moved in, and then the first legal settler in the Maxentucky Village area, a guy named John Hoham, still moved into Niswaukee's cabin. So clearly, it was better than living in a lean-to under a tree someplace. So Moses Scott, certainly our first carpenter, but not our first settler here. He is a pioneer in Logansport, but not one of our pioneers. That's just clearing things up. So as it happens, our old settlers wanted to be remembered, and they formed an Old Settlers Society in 1878. And the register from the Old Settlers Society still exists. It's in the Marshall County Historical Society library. I can go up and ask them to get it out for you and show you what's in it. I'm going to show you what's in it myself in just a second. They clearly thought of themselves by this period, 40 years later, as having done something important and wanting to memorialize it. It seems clear that Daniel MacDonald, who has his finger in every pie in Marshall County at the time, had something to do with this as well. But it was a popular idea for the first 3 years, and then it petered out after 1880 rather. But at least at the beginning, it seemed like a popular idea. I have to say, this summer sounds like my summer to bash on Daniel MacDonald, but I don't really mean to. But not only were they old settlers, they were old white supremacists. And if you read the first speech given at their opening meeting, it's all about the glories of the white race and how lucky it is that we came here and conquered those silly red people. And the worst, I mean, at our distance, the funniest, but the worst part of it is the speaker praises, I'm not quoting literally here, but he praises the ingenuity of the white race, which has penetrated into darkest Africa and found the sources of the Nile. Because presumably the people who were living at the sources of the Nile had no idea that they needed to be discovered. Anyway, but allowing for that, though, it's an important historical resource. The first name, you can see right here, is Robert Schroeder, 1853. This is Mr. Schroeder from MacDonald's 1881 History of Marshall County. MacDonald did an 1881 history and then another one in 1908. Both of them derived from the fact that he'd been running a newspaper, so it was easy for him to just recycle his old, not as easy as it is with cut and paste, but easy for him to recycle his old articles into books. So MacDonald's book has all these lovely lithographs, and we know Robert Schroeder, one of the first guys here. There were people in the sort of Moses Scott category here in as early as 1832. There's Samuel Tabor, and Charles Oosterhout. Oosterhout was a German, but he came from Canada. They had taverns on the south side of Plymouth. There's an early traveler's account. You may have heard in the Battle of Gettysburg about the charge of the main regiment down Round Top against the Confederates. The leader of the 20th Maine goes on to be a university president and a famous politician and so on, named Chamberlain. Well, his cousin, the less famous member of the Chamberlain family, became a prominent Indiana politician, and on his way through an early tour of Indiana, he describes coming right through here. He describes seeing Aubigny's funeral, or burial, non-burial, and he then describes, after he's been in just across the road in Fulton County and seen where Aubigny is propped up against a tree, then he goes up to Plymouth and he says, and I had to spend the night with this vile German who ran the tavern. That's Charles Oosterhout, one of our early settlers. And then Robert Schroeder was north of the city, sort of up by the Triway Drive-In, and over by Argus there was a character named Abel Hickman. So these are the people who come singly in 1832 to work as Indian agents and as traders, tavern keepers or whatever. I should have said about Moses Scott, by the way, just because it's interesting. Moses Scott was definitely an Indian agent to the degree that he followed the Potawatomi to Kansas and kept on being an Indian trader, and got involved in a dispute between the Baptists and the Jesuits. And the Indians are mostly Catholic. The Americans didn't really approve of all that French fancy Catholic stuff, and so they had Baptist missionaries, and there was jockeying for position between the Baptists and the Jesuits, and the Jesuits blamed Moses Scott for siding with the Baptists instead of with the Indians. In any case,
John?
Yes, sir.
What was the mode of transportation at that time?
Horse, if you had it. Ox pulled wagon, if you didn't. That was pretty much it. Or footing it, of course.
Right.
There was a lot of walking. But the Michigan Road was more like a cleared path than a road. And it wasn't until after our settlers came, or just as they came, that the state authorized paving the Michigan Road, and even then it wasn't paved worth very much. Just in that category of stories that aren't quite actually true, if you've driven south out of Logansport to where my grandmother used to live in Flora, you will pass the Sycamore Row, that lovely set of trees that goes up on this. And remember, the road eventually had to be routed around them. And there was a historical marker there that used to say, thanks to Captain Stubby and the Buccaneers. Captain Stubby lived in Deer Creek. There was a sign there that said that these sycamores had sprouted up from either end of the logs that had been used to pave the road. Apparently that's not true. and there's now a new historical sign that is much more reserved about what actually happened. But the State's Historical Society actually quotes it as an example of what you shouldn't do in a historical sign about, Sycamore Road. But in any case, that kind of thing was what the Michigan Road amounted to, whether or not those particular trees came from it or not. The road is completed in 1835. So, reading down the page a little farther, I covered it up. You can see this is starting in 1835 entries. The Jacobi family came. There's a Jacobi chapel, for instance, that the Waukegan Historical Society has preserved. But there are 20-some people 25 people who arrived in the class of 1835. Plymouth Township is separated from St. Joseph County in September of 1834. The road gets completed up from Logansport to Michigan City, insofar as it was completed. Plymouth was platted in the fall of 1834, and land actually went on sale in September of 1835. So some people came in 35 and settled, like the Jacobis, like John Houghton. But a lot of people came to buy land in the fall of 1835, just the heads of families, and after they bought the land, then they went back to their homes in southern Indiana and came with their families in 1836, which that's the big group of pioneers that we get in the summer of 1836, largely the descendants of, or the larger families, of heads of families who came in 35 to stake a claim. But some stayed over the winter, and the Jacobys are a good example. Besides, I had pictures of them.
They're from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, the people. So the logbook asks for where from, and people seem to have interpreted it liberally. Some people will tell you the county they actually came from on their way to Marshall County. Other people tell you where they were from, in the larger sense of the word. So I think the Jacobys came from southern India. I do not think they came here straight from Pennsylvania. So
Who did they buy the plotted land from?
from the government, I'm going to come back to that, because that's an important point, actually, as we'll see in a minute. If I don't mention that, we'll get back to it. So the last people in the class of 1835 are Catherine Corbin and Emma Dixon. They're sisters. They're the daughters, two of the daughters of John Houghton, the first treasurer of Marshall County, the first school commissioner of Marshall County, the first person to go bankrupt in Marshall County. We believe in spreading things out in our family. And there are two brothers from their family as well, who were the first two listed in 1835, but I didn't bother to pick them out. I picked her out because, as you probably know, she's our founding mother. Bayless Dixon, this is Mrs. Bayless Dixon. Bayless Dixon platted the town, as I said, in 1844. She had just had a baby, so I'm not sure she went up to Plymouth to fill out the paperwork. But
Not in that picture, right?
Not in that picture. She's 90 in that picture. She did get religion, but not to the degree of Abraham, Isaac, and that one. Then the class of 1836 starts, as you can see. And mind you, though these are all very tightly entered, what obviously happened is that on the 4th of July, there was somebody there writing down all these names. So it isn't that everybody had identical handwriting, it's that somebody was scribing them in the book. Anyway, so that's Emma, our ancestor, and my cousin, as I'll explain later. But as you read down the list in 1836, this is the first entry for 1836, as you read down the list, suddenly when you get to Alexander Campbell Thompson, they put in the day. Clearly, that July 26th bunch think there's something special about them as compared to the other people. The July 26th thing was, in the minds of the people who took part in it, was different from the other settlers who had just sort of trickled in over the previous 4 years. And in fact, Emma Houghton can help us sort out what these people thought was so special about themselves. So let me go on. They were coming up here from, mostly from Fayette and Rush counties. Those we said, some of them were liable to say anything, but largely from Fayette and Rush counties. Rush County had been, this was all Delaware County. There was a huge Delaware County in Indiana early on. But in effect, it was just the western half of Fayette County. So some of the people who came here in 35 and 36, particularly in 36, had already been pioneers once in Rush County, because once this land went on sale, they moved from Fayette into Rush, and then from there they moved up here. Again, we'll see why in a minute. But Emma had a letter, I put it on a copy of the paper version was in the letter, which she handed on to her brother James. James was in the Union Army in the Civil War and had a temporary promotion to captain because his actual captain got shot in the thumb and couldn't lead. So James stepped up. This was the Battle of Shiloh, where Lew Wallace became famous for not getting there fast enough to satisfy Grant. In any case, he was not in Lew Wallace's group, but he was actually in the battle. And for the rest of his life, he was Captain Houghton. Sort of like Captain Peacock on Are You Being Served? He had been captain for, 3 weeks or something while this. Anyway. So Captain Houghton went to the Plymouth Democrat in March of 1901. I've actually got this, you can see it. And hands in a letter that his sister Emma has preserved, which you won't be able to read, but the essence of it is that it's written from Ben Davis Creek in Fayette County on May 13th, 1822, and mailed at Connorsville on May 24th, written with handmade ink and a goose quill pen as envelopes that had been invented. The paper was folded blank side out in the form of an envelope, sealed with red sealing wax, paid 25 cents, written in the corner, and it was sent back to England. So this is Emma's father, John, in 1822, writing back to his family, and including his brother in England, and saying, you should come over. Great place. Well, first he says, he does mention, I was married on the 10th of January last to a young lady by the name of Rachel Logan, about 23 years of age, born in this country, but of European descent. She is a very agreeable companion, and I believe that her principal desire is to make me comfortable. Yeah, I know, she didn't want a credit card, let me tell you. Anticipating that his brother might come to this country, he advises him as to what wearing apparel and other personal effects to bring with him, but suggests that he not bring a dog along. So this is where he lived on Ben Davis Creek. This is a more recent map. As you can see, there are railroads. There were no railroads in Indiana in 1822. But this is Ben Davis Creek, and that just shows you where he lived in the southern corner there. So he sends this letter back to England. Well, we know it got there because it got to England and came back here in order to be handed into the Plymouth Democrat to be printed in the paper. So this is where it went. The Farm family were from the south of England. They were from a little house, a little something called the Manor Farm. This is the spot. Portsmouth, the great military naval center, is down here. The civilian naval center at Southampton is up there. And John Houghton, Emma's father, the one who's writing back, had in fact worked as a shipwright in Portsmouth. During his first trip to the United States, he had worked as a shipwright in New York City, traveled to the Bahamas, went back to England, didn't like it there, made a second trip to the U.S. It was on his second trip that he moved out to what was to become Indiana, what had just become Indiana. So this is the house they lived in. This is the house the letter arrived at. It looks a little grand to us in the fashion of old-fashioned English buildings, and it does date from the 17th century. But it was not all that grand when they lived there. This is the living room, so to speak. This was the original kitchen. This is a double-sided fireplace. Part of it is here, and the other part is just here in this picture. Those rooms still had dirt floors in the 1930s. So, I mean, pretty well packed down after 300 years, I suppose, but still it wasn't an elegant tourist spot. It was just a house on a farm. They did have, at this end of it, there's one rather larger room, which we might think of as sort of a front parlor. Part of their rental of the house was they had to provide a meeting room for the Earl of Risley, the Earl of Southampton, family name was Risley, if he wanted to meet with his tenants. So they had a big room, but it sort of only drove home the point that it wasn't really theirs, since they had to provide that for the Earl. Rows of bedrooms upstairs. When I stayed there, it was a B&B at the time I stayed there, and every place in England has to tell you they're the most haunted place in England, right? And they bring up the line, well, of course, there's probably a haunted house. On the other hand, they're your relatives, so you probably don't need to worry. So that's the place. And in fact, little brother did come over here, as we can tell partly by the fact that he brought the letter with him, and partly by the fact that in the Rush County marriage book by 1824, here he is, James Houghton, getting married to Hannah Morris. This is their record, their license to get married, and then the report that they were in fact married by Abraham Voris. Here he is, Abraham Voris. And then he returns the form back to the county to be officially recorded. So the letter gets sent in 1822. He has time to pack up, not bringing his dog, come over to this country, settle, and marry this nice girl, I'm sure. She's my grandmother, right? Miss Logan. Abraham Voris does a lot of marrying for these folks. I'm not sure that he was the only ordained minister in the area, but obviously they were pretty thin on the ground. So if you look at a lot of these early pioneer marriages from that county, they're done by Abraham Voris. So James Houghton was apparently a moderately organized person. He was trained as a wagon maker. And so he actually did some wagon making kind of work down there, and he kept a record book of it, which we have. And the Historical Society has, that they let me borrow it, which is good because I gave it in the first place. But here it is. So this book, and since they came here in 1836, we know that he brought it with him from southern Indiana. So it's one of the oldest things we have in the county. I mean, barring rocks and Native American, one of the oldest European things that we have in the county. They asked me to not take it out of the envelope. But thanks to Jeff, we have, as Patty said, we like to digitize things, and thanks to Jeff, we have digital copies of all the pages. And then the County Historical Society has made transcripts of all the pages as well. So if you're actually interested in seeing what kind of commercial dealings your ancestors in Marshall County might have had before they came to Marshall County, it would be in this book someplace. So, parenthetically, I don't think this is his handwriting. There were itinerant guys in the pioneer period who were, and they're probably one step ahead of beggars, but they would go from house to house, and they weren't like the guy I saw outside of Aldi's the other day playing the violin, who started Ave Maria as soon as I came out the door. I gave him money. But they were busking in the sense they would go from house to house, and calligraphy was one of the skills. And so I suspect, I don't think that's James's handwriting, but I think that's a traveling calligrapher who wrote his name for it. In any case, that's the back cover. This is his handwriting. And you see him dealing with all the names that we're used to seeing in Marshall County history that we'd see on this monument out there, but dealing with them down there. So here's John Voris, selling John Voris a coffin, sadly, and then Samuel Logan a coffin as well. Apparently, building a coffin is like building a wagon, except smaller and no wheels. But he did a lot of coffin building. There was a thing that would go through in the summers called milk sickness, and lots of people died of milk sickness. And somewhat ironically, a woman discovered, a midwife, discovered that it was caused, it's even worse than that. A midwife discovered by conversation with a Native American woman that it was caused by a cow eating white snake root, a plant which has a poisonous compound. This research was, she did her best to publicize it. It was, of course, completely forgotten because a woman discovered it. And sometime in, I think, the 1970s, they started scratching their heads and saying, I wonder what used to cause that milk sickness that people got. And they found out it was just what the lady said it was. In any case, so I don't know for a fact, but I suspect milk sickness maybe had something, but there were other things went around too. So John Voris is his wife's sister's husband. Samuel Logan is his brother's brother-in-law. Elihu Morris, down here, where is it there? Elihu Morris is his wife's brother. The Blakeleys settled up on the south side of Twin Lakes, so not Union Township settlers. John Houghton obviously is his brother. Abraham Voris is the guy who married him. So clearly an economic community already going on. He wasn't doing a big business, right? All of 1 year fits on a page in that book. So it wasn't like he was out building a coffin every day. But there were commercial connections between these people before they ever thought about coming up here, which is the point of it. Not only business connections, of course, as I've already hinted. John Houghton marries Rachel Logan. James Houghton marries Hannah Morris. We just saw that. Lewis Thompson marries Phoebe Dixon as his first wife. John H. Voris marries Phoebe Morris. The Vorises and the Morrises, confusing. Thomas McDonald marries Elizabeth Dixon McDonald, and I almost made the joke, but I didn't by putting this picture in twice. After her husband dies, or I'm sorry, the other way around. After she dies, and after her twin sister's husband dies, then he remarries the twin, so I could have just put the same picture on the other side. But I thought that would be tacky, and I didn't want to do it. These are the parents of Daniel MacDonald, the historian. So all these people are, again, my point is they're all married before 1831, before they come here. So they do business with each other before they come here. They get married to each other before they come here. They're already a community before they get into the covered wagons. And then, if all these people get married, of course, then there's genealogical issues. This is Daniel MacDonald here, his father, his mother, his stepmother, Alexander Thompson, we saw briefly before. I talked about this on the railroad talk, but they are first cousins, second cousins, once removed, whatever it is, and genetic half-siblings since their mothers are identical twins. We have Bayless Dixon, who is their cousin, our founder, marries Emma Houghton. The people who are in boldface are people in these pictures. The people who are in red are people who came here in July of 1836. So you get a sense of how it was a migration of people all related to each other. So this is Daniel MacDonald. This, of course, is Emma Houghton, looking slightly younger than she does in the other picture. She's only 80 in this one. This is her cousin Thomas Houghton, my direct ancestor. This is William Voris, from whom descend the Robinsons and the Hattons, and so this is Jeff's something or other great-grandfather, and Mrs. Kelly's great-grandfather as well. And John Voris, about whom I'll say more in just a second. So all these people are babies brought up here. Well, she was a teenager in 1835, but the other three at least are cousins, one way or the other, cousins and Churchill relations. We're all babies brought up here in the Conestoga wagons, right? They're up to 4 or 5 years old. He's born in 1834, so he was a 2-year-old. I assume they didn't let him out to walk along beside the oxen, but who knows? They can get rambunctious at that age.
Excuse me, John,
Yeah.
how were these photographs taken, and when were they taken?
Oh, much later, yeah. These photographs are, so this, as I say, this is literally when she's 80, this is like 1902. This is for Daniel MacDonald's second history book, so 1908.
Were they like traveling photographers, or?
Yeah, by that time there were photographic studios set up in the towns. There was a studio in Plymouth, there was a studio here in Culver. So Emma's house was on the site of the Lucretius Tavern, or her cabin was, it was later a tin shop, and if I'm not mistaken, there was actually a photography studio there at one point. So once photography caught on, but after it spread more to the frontier, there were photographic studios here in Plymouth and Argus and so on. So every place had someplace you could go, and as long as you wanted to sit still long enough, you could get your picture back there. Yeah. In fact, I'm not sure you can see, but she's obviously sitting. He's leaning on the side of a couch here. His wife is sitting in the chair. So there's things to help them be stable long enough to get their picture taken.
It is a long time.
Yeah. And I mean, it got faster. I don't mean to say that everything was with the technology of the 1860s, but they did. It took a certain amount of time. If you want to drive to Plymouth, if you have occasion to drive to Plymouth and drive along State Road 17, you can see in the memorial forest the old West Township Trustees cabin, just to give you an idea of the cabin. And this is, I didn't put him with the others, but this is John Voris, who was the last of those cousins to, and the last of the pioneers in general, to be alive. This picture is from a little tiny book called, I think it's called The Story of Marshall County by Minnie Swindell, who was a grade school teacher, and it's written for grade school students. But she put in some pictures, and she had a picture taken, obviously staged, of John Voris, who I think was not actually out cutting wood on a daily basis when he was nearly 100 years old. But, in any case, there he is. If you are a connoisseur of cabins, if you're not, there's a sign on the side, but if you're a connoisseur of cabins, you know that this Township Trustees cabin was a second generation cabin, not the cabin that somebody built as soon as they got here. Anyone know how you can tell? No, I was hoping nobody did. I only found out yesterday. It's because the logs are square. When they first got here and were in a hurry, they would go out, cut down a tulip tree, put some notches in it, and make a cabin. Then after they got settled, if they had a little more leisure, they would make a fancier house with the logs cut square to make an actual, a better seal, of course, but also make it look nicer. Still a dirt floor probably inside, though they could put a plank floor in. But that's the kind of, granted that's small because it's built as an office, not as a home. But that's the kind of thing that they would have been living in after they'd gotten themselves settled.
John, where did they move that from?
It used to be up on the corner across from West Township School. As you make the right-hand turn, it was back. It wasn't exactly off the road. But if you didn't know to look at it, you wouldn't have seen it. But yeah.
It's a great spot now.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's right there. You can see it. And they're taking nice care of it.
Did that house have like a loft or?
This one didn't, as far as I know. But yeah, they typically would have had. Yeah. And not only just physically bigger in terms of one room, but many of them were built with two sides and a dog trot in between. So you got.
He could have brought his dog.
He could have brought his dog after all. Yes, I obviously, as you know, have been not sympathetic to Uncle John's comments about the canine settlers. But. So why did these people come here? Getting back to the question, if those are the people, why did they come here in the first place? Well, They came here in the first place because of clear title to land. Thomas Lincoln, father of you-know-who, was from Kentucky, and came here from Kentucky because he lost several farms in Kentucky because he couldn't get clear title to the land. So he bought it, was out the money, and then didn't get the farm. In Indiana, any place in the Northwest Territory, but Indiana obviously just across the river in Kentucky, Indiana and the rest of the Northwest Territory, as a result of the Northwest Ordinance, every square inch had already been surveyed. You were buying it for the government, and you knew you were getting 160 acres or 80 acres or 640 acres or whatever it was. You knew exactly what you were getting, and you had clear title. So just being able to get the land and hold on to it was the first reason for coming to Indiana in general. But there's also a cultural difference. The people who settled in the lovely rolling countryside of beautiful southern Indiana, Fayette, Rush, even Brown County. Brown County is a little more rolling, but all that territory, lovely maple trees for sugar maple. The people who settled there mostly came from the backwoods of Virginia, similar hilly country, and they moved there and kept on doing what they'd been doing back home, because it looked like home, and they just did the same things. Garrison Keillor used to say that Minnesota was settled by people who got there and got there in the summer and decided to remember them in Sweden, and then when winter came, they remembered why they left Sweden in the first place. But these people came from Virginia. They settled down, and they liked all this, and they did all the things the way they had done them at home. In particular, they had farms where they raised their, or intended at least, to raise their families, and their families would live on farms, and everybody would be happy. You'd have to do a little trade with some guy in the, some guy over there makes coffins, and some guy down here is a blacksmith, but basically you live on your little farm and do your farming and run your own business, and everybody's happy. Southern Indiana, people talked like they were from Northern Virginia or Kentucky or any of those sort of mildly hillbilly kind of places.
Still do.
And still do. And this is the big divide in Indiana history. Comes out of these three waves of settlement, three different ways of culture, three different waves of language. And all of those trace back, as our speaker last year was pointing out, to the glaciers. Because the people who didn't stay, our people, the people who moved north because they wanted an easier place to farm. This was a plow for the people from Virginia in southern Indiana. It's just a shovel. I mean, that's all there is to it. It's a shovel that pulled by an ox. Didn't bother clearing out rocks. Clearing out rocks was considered a sign that you were a German settler. That the Germans were picky that way, and they would pick the rocks out of their fields. But these people from Virginia just steered around them or ran over them or whatever they needed to do. And it didn't turn the ground over very much, right? So our people, the people who came here, I don't mean to skip over parenthetically, but I mean skip over the people who settled in the middle of the state, were mostly from places like Pennsylvania and so on. My mother's family were from Pennsylvania, settled in Carroll County. So that's how we ended up with three different ways of talking in three different parts of the state, because three different sets of culture. But the people who came up here, who were known to the people from southern Indiana as Yankees, this was well before the local war came, but the Yankees who came to northern Indiana, they had moldboard plows from back home, plows that could turn the dirt over, but they were made out of wood. They had just a metal edge, and the metal edge would cut the soil, but the black dirt and soil around here was so rich that the wooden board of the plow couldn't turn it over. It would just stick to the side of the plow, and that, fine, but it didn't work at all. This gentleman, you may know his name. You don't recognize his picture. Imagine he was green. Imagine this suit was green, and his name was written on it in yellow. That is John Deere. And John Deere invents an all-metal plow, an all-steel plow. Also, his rival, of course, James Oliver, 20 years later, comes up with a similar one. So John Deere makes it possible then to really take advantage of the soil here and do a lot of commercial farming. But before John Deere, it's already the case that these people up here came here because they wanted to do commercial farming. They wanted to have a farm and raise, I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
No, just don't know where John Deere's.
John Deere from Indiana?
I used to Illinois.
Oh, that's okay.
Close enough.
Close enough, yeah, what can I do? But the plow was I threw him in for interest, but the plow was the important part. Thus, the pioneers came up here because they wanted large stretches of level ground that they could farm easily for a profit. And they brought older culture with them. So things that are typical of northern Indiana that you didn't see in southern Indiana. Fruit trees. They went out and gathered fruit in southern Indiana. They didn't have orchards. Dairying as a business, as opposed to just having a cow for your family. And that usually meant that up here dairying was men's work, whereas in southern Indiana, just going out and milking the cow was ladies' work. I mean, give or take, because you send the kids out to do things too, of course. Haymaking, actually selling it to somebody else as opposed to just gathering hay for your own people. A northern Indiana thing, not a southern Indiana thing. And what turns out to be my favorite, cider instead of whiskey. Southern Indiana, they drank whiskey. I mean, raising corn, you make whiskey. Northern Indiana, they had orchards. They also had cider. So hard cider is a northern Indiana thing. Whiskey was a southern Indiana thing. You can look in books and find all sorts of things about vocabulary and so on. When I was a kid, this particular one has died out, but one of the evidences that northern Indiana was settled by people from Old England and New England was if you're standing at the edge of a house and there's a curved metal piece that runs along the edge of the house that catches the water and leads it over and then eventually it comes down. What do you call the curved metal piece along the edge of the house?
Gutter.
Oh, you're all gutter people?
Yeah.
It's an eaves trough. Right? It's a trough on the eaves of your house. Right? It's an eaves trough, and that's a New England expression, a northern Indiana expression, which you don't hear in the rest of the state. I've got a million examples, but I won't go through them. The other, and just to be clear, surprisingly enough, the steel plow was the last of the major farming inventions. The threshing machine is the first one, 1799 in the U.S. My grandmother used to still say if she was expecting a group of people that she was cooking for a threshing crew.
Yeah.
Right? Because you had one threshing machine that went from one farm to another. Nobody owned their own threshing machine. The reaper from Cyrus McCormick in Illinois is 1834. The combine, the reaper and thresher put together, is 1835, and then the steel plow comes in 1836. So our pioneers are getting here just at the right time to start taking advantage of all of these developments, and it's farming that they're interested in.
When did the Oliver plow come in?
The Oliver plow is 1857. And I'm so glad you asked me because I had written down. I couldn't have told you that yesterday, but I almost put in a picture of Mr. Oliver too, but I didn't. Corn, I should have mentioned, this is the kind of corn they were growing. Not what we think of as very attractive. And I've forgotten the technical name for it. It's called gourd seed corn. Corn like the Indian corn was flint corn, and somebody hybridized those in the 1840s and developed the corn that we're used to growing. When they first got here, they had to grow corn. Wheat was grown in northern Indiana, tasted so vile they couldn't even get the pigs to eat it. So they had to grow corn in order to degrade the soil enough they could grow wheat. And then there was a period there where wheat was actually the main Indiana crop. And then as the Great Plains opened up, it wasn't profitable anymore, and corn then replaced it as the signature item in the Indiana culture. It turns out that apparently the balancing is that you get a bigger yield per acre out of corn, the wheat is a lot less trouble to plant. So that was the trade-off. Anyway, so that's what they came here for. An example of that, just going back to Bayless Dixon and Emma Houghton and all those people. So Bayless fans the town, obviously here where we're sitting. As I said, their house was where Lucrezia's is. The corner of the quarter square mile on the corner of their platted town was the parking lot across from the Collins building down on South Main Street. And then the other edge of it, as I said, is along Coolidge. Harding. I'm determined to get the wrong Republican in it. Along Harding. So they sell Bayless and Emma get religion. He becomes a preacher in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and she's an activist as well. So they sell the town to his, I forget the order, but to his father, then to his brother, then his father goes bankrupt. The father tries to save the town for the family by selling it to one of his sons in a fake transaction, and that gets sold. Eventually it's auctioned off on as an asset, auctioned off on the steps of the courthouse, and his son buys it back anyway. So the farm part goes back and forth. The northern edge remains in Emma's name for some time until she finally sells it to her cousin, my twice great grandfather Thomas. And so the edge is north of Lakeshore Drive, but south of College Avenue. If you think about driving up Main Street to get to the funeral home, there's a house ahead of you at the end of that street, and so it's a dead end with a lot on it, and then beyond that there's actually a second lot, and that was the edge of the town plat. But if you think about how the area, say roughly speaking, north of College Avenue is different from the part that we're sitting in, it reinforces the point about what they were doing here. It's what happens when you get to College Avenue. Think about it if you're riding a bicycle from here.
Well, you're going up the hill to get
You're
to
going up the hill, right? And once you get to College Avenue, it's flat all the way to Burr Oak.
Oh,
So the top half of the property, they sold off to Thomas to farm, because what they wanted as farmers was flat, rich land. And if you look at all these early settlers, Jeff makes this point all the time, all these early settlers come here, they look at the lake, they say, oh, that's so beautiful, it's lovely. I don't want to buy land down here, right? It's hilly, it's rocky, it's steep. I want to go out to Burr Oak, where it's lovely and flat and rich. And all these original people were at Burr Oak Flats. And the first post office in the area, before the postmaster moves here and brings the post office with him, but the first post office isn't in Uniontown, it's on the Yellow River, because Burr Oak was the place that Burr Oak wasn't there yet, but the Burr Oak Flats were there, and that was the place to be. Of course, the oldest cemetery is out there as well. So that the settlement area was where there was flat land, and the reason you could build a town in here was because who wanted this land for anything else? It's swampy, it's hilly, and my cousin who likes to farm will take the other half of it. That's what they would think.
So if it wasn't swamp, was it wooded? Was it
Yeah, it was all.
This whole area
Yeah,
was
all
wooded?
woods, yeah. There is an early description that clarifies, that describes the woods as being sort of a big E shape of woodlands with some empty spaces in the interstices, but it's basically like that.
When you
Yes, ma'am.
talk about somebody platted the town, was that their land?
Yeah, so he
And
bought
so he
a,
actually owned the town?
yeah. It's as if I were to open a subdevelopment, except this is the initial subdevelopment for the town. So yeah, he owns the land. What happened was, so this is section 16, which of the townships, which meant that it had to be sold for school, supported the public schools. So they get it surveyed off into strips that are 1/4 mile wide along the top, but are of varying lengths because the lake takes a bite out of the south end. So that whole square mile, if you want to think about how big the square mile is, the north edge of it is 17th Road, so right south of the watercraft place on the way to Burr Oak. The western edge of it is where Logansport Gate is. That stretch of Academy Road is the road along that edge. And this alley behind it, School Street, is the other edge. So it's a mile from this alley to Logansport Gate. And then the southern edge, as I said, is down here at the parking lot at Collins's. So it's a square mile with a gap. People who taught even at IU, not to mention Purdue, who if you ask them what department, I'm in the math department. What do you teach in the math department? I teach algebra. Right, because it's just that's how you pronounce the letter Y at the end of a word. So lots of things like that are just. If you make a survey of where people say wash versus wash, right, that begins to break down the settlement pattern in the state as well.
Washington, that was us.
Yeah. It's very, very dependent on where you are. And all of Indiana history is the struggle between the southern counties that liked their little farms and those obnoxious people up north who wanted all this commercial stuff. And it goes right down, you know, let me think of another example, but the founding of IU, which was written into the state constitution, opposed by people from southern Indiana because they didn't see any reason for all that much education. You know, why did the state need to have a seminary, even if it was put in the southern part of the state, in Bloomington? And then when Purdue came along, oh my God, you know, if you need to go to college to find out how to farm, what's wrong with you people, right? So yeah, there's just the tension between different parts of the state has been there literally since the beginning. Well, not since the beginning because the northern part wasn't here yet, but as soon as the northern part opened up, then there's been tension back and forth between them. I have a letter, I mentioned that, you know, Emma Houghton and Tom Houghton were cousins. They were only first cousins, so it's not surprising that they knew, but they were conscious of being cousins. And this is a letter from Emma, written to Thomas. This is March 20th, 1916. So she was in her 90s. And she writes, "My dear cousin Thomas, while I lie on my bed most of the time, I have very much to be thankful for," again, she was a minister's wife, "as I can help myself a great deal. I am now in my 94th year.
Gee.
Have tarried here on earth a long time while many of my loved ones have crossed over the river. I think of you very often and was very sorry to hear of your severe accident. I hope you have not had to suffer severely, and I wish it lay in my power to administer to your wants. I have always appreciated the many kindnesses you have shown me. Give my love to Rachel and all the children. Very best love to my only cousin from Emma Dixon." There it is, I'll put it there.
Very
I didn't bring the envelope, but she's 90, whatever she says she is, 94, right? She had forgotten the name of the town. It had changed one. So the envelope is actually addressed to Uniontown, which is what she and her husband had named it, right? And then she crosses that out. She's sure that isn't it. And finally she writes Argus. And so if it gets to Argus, the Argus postmaster forwards it to Culver. But it's very sweet. I don't know if I didn't bring that part, but I'll put it over there so you can see it as well. So this is literally one pioneer writing to another in their 90s. By the time this is written, Thomas has decided to move off the farm. So if you think about where the funeral home sits, there's a parking lot next to the funeral home. And at the northeastern edge of that parking lot, there's a concrete block stone house with some green detailing on the roof ends. That's Thomas Houghton's house. So he moved off the farm by coming 3 lots south of where the edge of the farm was in order to move into town. But that's what he was doing there. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you remind me the dates of the name changes of the town?
I can remind you the facts. The dates are a little leafier.
Okay.
So it's originally Uniontown. When Thomas takes it over from Thomas, Emma's brother, not Thomas, their cousin, but Thomas K, I'll call him for the sake of convenience. When Thomas K takes over from Emma, or from his father and the fire sale, blah, 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 but after all that stuff, Thomas K settles down as the proprietor. Daniel MacDonald says that it's 1851, and it is 1851 that he takes it over, but he doesn't actually change the name in 1851. We know that because the person who suggests the name change is old Doc Durr. Doc Durr was actually a pharmacist, but he practiced medicine here in Culver. He had lived in Stark County and had been a postmaster in Stark County, and he wasn't living here in 1851. But when he did come and suggested a name change to something fancier than Uniontown, they had all lived in Union Township in Rush County before they got here, so that was the connection. So, but suggested something fancier than Uniontown, and apparently Thomas said, yeah, so what do you got? And Dr. Durr said, how about Marmont? Marmont was the last of Napoleon's generals to defect, marshals of the empire to defect. And once Marmont defected to the royalists, then the road to Paris was open, and so Napoleon was captured, and so on and so forth. So the Bonapartists despised Marmont, and Marmont had been made by Napoleon, had been made Duke of Ragusa, which is in Yugoslavia. not in Yugoslavia anymore, but one of the countries that resulted from Yugoslavia. So Ragousser in French means to be a turncoat, to be a traitor. So that they literally made his name into a word of scorn. But for whatever reason, Dr. Durr liked him. And so we were Marmont then for a number of years. After Mr. Culver came here and set up shop and became obvious that he was going to be an industrial help to the town, the people of the town fathers, were all happy to change the name of the town to Culver City. It's in the 1880s now,
1897 is what it
1897. Right. So Mr. Culver, always willing to grease a wheel here or there, notices, so the post office points out, that there's already a Culver, Indiana, down in Tippecanoe County. So Mr. Culver goes down with a checkbook in hand and says, I understand that your town is named after a crane culver. Would you consider changing the name to Crane, Indiana, if someone were to underwrite all the expenses? Someone would underwrite all the expenses. So they said, fine, we'll change it to Crane, Indiana, which they did. So now the way was open for Culver to become for Marmont to become Culver City, and they did so vote. And it remained Culver City until the 1940s. So if you remember the drugstore downtown on this side, the one eventually became Mr. T's, the sign used to say Culver City Drugs. It was because it was the drugstore in Culver City. The government, however, said you cannot possibly be Culver City. There are only 600 people living there. We're not going to pay a cent. So the post office was called Culver, and the train station was Culver. So legally, the town was Culver City, but the post office was Culver, and the train was Culver. And finally, at the end of the 1940s, the town council threw up its hands and said, enough, we surrender, and they took the city off the name of the town as well. So that's the genealogy of it. Anything else? I think we covered the things that are coming up. I was going to ask my cousin Jeff to run over them, but do you want to just remind us what we have coming?
Yeah, just as Patty said, the next event is August 10th, the Tina Turner concert, and then August 24th, you're stuck with me right here talking. When we say the golden age, we're talking about, it really picks up. This is John and I talked about kind of back to the roots this summer, kind of laying the original foundation of the story of Culver. So we had the Native American thing, we had the pioneers, and once the railroad gets here, what makes Culver really what it becomes, among other things, not like it's only that, but the steamboat era with the beautiful hotels and the celebrities and the kind of just 5,000, 7,000 people here every weekend. So that's my talk on the 24th of August, and then our annual Stories and Stones. If you're still around town and you haven't been to that, I think we have a really cool lineup this year. Speaking of drugstores, we have descendants of Mr. T's and McKinnis Pharmacy presenting. We have Don Mikesell, the police chief representative, Eunice Scrimshire, for those who are local and remember her. And I'm forgetting others, but it's a good. It'll be great. And that's on September. Did we say 19th? It's that weekend. Whatever that Saturday is at 1 o'clock in the town cemetery. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, John.